Okay, so the last video got cut off. I won't make this one as long. So those things, the stereotypes of the British, I was reading off the Wikipedia list. I want to tackle a few others that may be out there. Um, Arrogance. Well, this may actually be something that is found in every major power. That is, every country that has had either now or in the past, a point of significant global influence. We certainly did. Like I said, the British Empire was the largest empire in history. We had a massive role in shaping the modern world, and that's just a fact. It isn't, that's not bombastic. That is verifiable fact. Um, but are we seen as arrogant? Well, I think we can be quite. I don't think we're as nationalistic as some countries. I don't think we're as nationalistic as Americans or indeed some countries in Asia. However, that doesn't mean that it doesn't occasionally crop up. Um, we have our own culture wars going on here, much like the United States. And an example of this would be the recent thing over Land of Hope and Glory and Rule Britannia, where there was a right leaning backlash against plans to scrap that at the last night of the proms, which is a classical music event. So I do think occasionally the British can be seen as nationalistic, maybe a bit pompous. Um, I try myself not to display that too much, but I'm patriotic enough to defend my country when it's being unfairly maligned. So that might be a stereotype, although I don't think that one's unique to the British. I think it could be charged to other countries too. There's some countries, for example, that have a reputation for machismo, particularly Latin countries, I would imagine. Okay, what else? Stiff upper lip. Let me loosely address this one. I think sometimes the British are seen as being a bit stiff, a bit distant. Um, and with that, we may come across as not the friendliest people in the world. I think there's a few things to look at with that. I think the average British person is quite hospitable, easygoing. However, I think maybe the politeness thing overlaps a bit with this. Maybe we are seen as a little bit stiff at times, a little bit formal. I mean, of course, I could say, well, there's a lot of things that contradict that. The British class structure is probably part of that. Programs like Downton Abbey, although Downton Abbey is a great series, it very much is the Britain of the past. And I think some people look at Downton Abbey and maybe think there's a little bit of that in the British today. I honestly think since about the 80s, the class system has significantly eroded. I don't think it's entirely gone, but I do think it's eroded significantly. Nevertheless, we do have different social um, demographics, different social, for want of a better term. I don't want to say classes because I don't think it's a class system, but there is different segments of society. There's no escaping that. You get wealthier people and poorer people. You get people who are brought up in a certain way. As an example of this, there's the chav subculture. And that's a pejorative. It refers to usually working class people of low education, young people who sort of sit on street corners drinking a lot, and they can be quite aggressive. And it's a big British stereotype. An example of this would be the program Little Britain. Now, anyone who's watched Little Britain, that's extremely exaggerated. Obviously, it's comedy, and this is a good example of that sort of self-deprecation. Remember, it's a British show. Um, I mean, that's a very good example, actually, of British self-deprecation. However, it is taking certain existing things, like the chav subculture, and exaggerating them a bit. So the character of Vicky Pollard, for example, is based on young single mothers who are a bit uncouth and a bit loud, just a bit. I mean, that's so some might say it's not that big an exaggeration. Um, but then you can see this in other countries. Equivalents, I guess, would be in the United States, white trash. And apologies for using that term if anyone's offended. In Australia, bogans. Um, so you can see this in other English-speaking countries. There's certain subclasses, so to speak. Again, it's probably not a good idea to generalize and to focus on these things. Nevertheless, they're not entirely false. They're not entirely misleading because there are certain traits of society out there that there's no escaping the fact that that is out there. Um, what else can I say? Trying to think of other things that people might think of us. Yeah, I mentioned in the previous video football hooligans contrasting with the reputation for politeness. Um, Britons are quite boisterous. An example I would make is boxing. I'm a boxing fan. If you contrast British fans to continental European fans, for example, Germans and French tend to be a bit more muted, the crowds, particularly French. British fans can be quite boisterous and quite loud. You know, they can take the patriotism to quite a high level. Or another example would be Japanese fans. From what I've observed, they tend to be quite muted and polite and respectful. British fans can be quite boisterous, sometimes too much so. For example, I've seen British football fans and boxing fans jeer another country's national anthem. For example, if a British guy is fighting a guy from another country and his anthem comes up, unfortunately, some British fans think they boo it, and I don't like that. As a Briton, I find that a bit embarrassing. So I do think that might be something that lends itself to stereotype British sports fans being badly behaved. Unfortunately, that one isn't entirely without basis. We have to admit we do have a problem with boisterous sport fans. Having said that, I think that's also true in Latin America. Countries like Argentina, Mexico, definitely. I would say Mexican boxing fans are very loud. Um, so I wouldn't say it's unique to the British. With football, Turkey's got a reputation for being quite machismo, so has Egypt. So that's not something that is entirely unique to the British. Thinking of nationalism in sport, you definitely see it with Russians and Chinese, increasingly with Chinese as well. Um, so unfortunately, sometimes politics and sport do get muddled, and I think that's unfortunate. You see it at the Olympics. But you know, Britons can be quite proud people. I mean, we do very well at the Olympics, and I don't deny I'm proud of that. We are a very sport loving nation. Many sports were invented in this country, so Britain too get quite passionate about it. The next one, I don't know if it's a national stereotype, but it's definitely something you see in the UK. We are quite pro-military, more so than other European countries. What I mean by that is we take military events pretty seriously. Um, the Remembrance Day events, you know, particularly in my city, you will get thousands of people come out to the 11th of November commemorations. Um, and respect for the military is particularly high in the UK. I mean, you could argue it's high in other countries as well, but you know, I mean, for example, Russia, they really take that seriously because, of course, Russia suffered so much in World War II. But I do think the British are quite you know, if you look at the tabloids, they always have headlines like supporting our armed forces, respect for the boys, all this sort of thing. So I think that might be something that lends itself to stereotype. But in that sense, I think we're similar to the Americans. We're quite, I don't want to say militaristic, although we have certainly been involved in a lot of wars. But yeah, I would say it's like respect for the military is quite a big thing. This maybe contrasts to some other European countries where it's more muted. Um, Yeah, so I would say that is something that's quite obvious in British society. I mean, every town and city in the UK, you'll find a war memorial. I'm not sure if you get that in other European countries. Maybe in France, certainly there's lots of military cemeteries, but I would say the military is a very big part of our culture. Um, what else can I say? I would say I would conclude with this. The 2012 London Olympics opening ceremony, directed by Danny Boyle, I would say that was a pretty fair representation of British culture. That was pretty successful, and it's generally ranked among the best opening ceremonies of all Olympics. usually in the top 10, often in the top five. Um, and I think with good reason. I thought it was very well done. I loved it, and so did a lot of my compatriots. Um, I'm trying to think of other things just to throw in here. Ignorance about geography, considering that we once colonized the world, a lot of Britons are not as informed as we could be about geography, which bugs me personally, maybe because I like geography and I'm quite adept at it. So I do think that's an area where we probably could be more informed. A lot of Britons are not as informed as they should be. However, I would say that Britons probably read more than some countries. We read newspapers extensively. We read books a lot. We are a literature loving nation, not just a country rich in literature, from William Shakespeare to Charles Dickens to J.K. Rowling and beyond. But I think Britain, the average Briton probably does read quite a bit, maybe more so than some countries. But we also watch a lot of TV and watch a lot of films. So anyway, I'll round this up. No doubt there'll be other things to throw in there, but this is just scratching the surface. Um, I'll just conclude with this. When it comes to national stereotypes, there's always some truth in it, because, like I say, they come from certain traits that people observe. However, what is important is that we don't judge others solely based on their nationality. Now, obviously, if someone's playing up a negative part of their nationality, then it might not help. Say, for example, you get an American who maybe is quite loud and they're quite all America's best at everything. That might lend to a stereotype. If you have a Briton who's a bit sort of let's say stiff upper lip, that might tie into our national stereotypes. Um, Chinese tourists behaving badly. There's a lot of negative stereotypes out there, but let's not forget there's positive stereotypes as well. Um, Stereotypes don't just have to be negative. You can also get positive stereotypes. And I'll just conclude with this on a positive note. I would say one of the best things about the British people, to generalize, is generosity. British people give a lot of money to charity, and we give a lot of money to overseas charities. When there's been a big disaster somewhere in the world, you can guarantee that British people will donate handsomely to it. Now, I'm not saying that other countries don't, but I do think that we are a very generous nation overall. And you will find that the average British person is pretty compassionate. You know, people, although we have serious social problems, you'll find, for example, the British are very compassionate when it comes to animal welfare. Homelessness, most people, no, I shouldn't say most people, but a lot of people will give homeless people change or buy them a warm drink. I think there is a generosity of spirit with the British people, and I think that's a good thing. But like I say, you have good and bad people everywhere. For my part, I never judge individuals according to their nationality. You know, I try to be blind to that. It's not always easy, but I do try. Um, I'll leave it there. If you have any questions about Britain or the British, free to ask. I don't know if I exhibit stereotypes or not. I certainly don't do it consciously, but put it this way, if people look at me and see positive British stereotypes like politeness, I'm not going to complain about that. Okay, I have no way to know how others perceive me, but like I say, positive stereotypes are positive. We can't generalize, but I'll round it up. Thanks for watching.